Hi, everyone. It's so nice you came out this afternoon. Thank you for coming to find out about Matilda. Sometimes when I talk about her, people say, well, I've never heard of her. Well, there's a reason for that, and I'll explain it today. I want to thank Christine Reeder, who's been wonderful to work with, for inviting me here today. And I'm proud to be a part of this Women Win the Vote series. Anyway, today I do want to introduce you to Matilda. And she was a famous national leader in the early decades of the women's movement. She was an author, a speaker, an organizer, a nationally known celebrity who worked very closely with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But if you haven't heard of her, there's a reason. Matilda, who was the youngest of those three women, died first. And after she died, the other two, her so-called friends, wrote her out of history. So I'm trying to write her back in with this book. Matilda herself, oops, I went ahead too fast. Matilda herself gave me the title for the book. In 1893, she was home in her home in Fayetteville, New York, near Syracuse one evening, and a deputy sheriff came and knocked on the door. And he had come to arrest her. And she said later, everything I had ever done wrong went through my head. And what he had come to arrest her for was registering to vote. And she said, but I forgot that I was a born criminal, a woman. So she did go to court, and she was found guilty of registering to vote. And she appealed that decision, and she lost the appeal, too. So she was a born criminal because she was a woman. Matilda was born in 1826 near Syracuse, just as the Erie Canal opened. So the Erie Canal brought a lot of new people to the Syracuse area and a lot of prosperity, too. At the same time, it displaced the Native Americans who were living there, but not all of them. I mean, some of them were moved out and moved on, but there are still Haudenosaunee, they're called a confederation of 5 Indian nations, also called the Iroquois by the Canadians. Lots of them still live around Syracuse, and in those times, Matilda was able to attend Indian events and Indian fairs. She was very interested in their system of government in which women had rights equal to those of men, very unlike women in the United States. But in the Haudenosaunee Nation, they had equal rights. So that always intrigued her. Matilda's father, Hezekiah Gage, was a doctor, and he rode on horseback to treat his patients. Sometimes he took Matilda with him, and from a young age, she became his medical assistant. And she wanted to become a doctor, too. She loved the work. Matilda's mother, who was well educated for the time, taught her daughter to love history and to study history. And Matilda especially liked reading about famous women in history. I don't have a picture of her mother. They had probably a library of some 400 books in their house, so she had a lot of books to read. A lot of them were medical books. This was their house. It was the very nicest one in Cicero, New York, and it was a stop on the Underground Railroad. It was a gathering place for intellectuals. Matilda's father espoused all liberal causes, fought for the rights of people of all races, even for women, even for children, which was very unusual at the time. And he insisted that his only child, Matilda, be included in every conversation, that every question she asked be answered respectfully, and she got to stay up as late as she wanted to. As a girl, Matilda learned that organized religion considered women inferior to men. She did not believe what she was taught, which was that woman had brought sin into the world and thus was responsible for all evil. She did not believe that. And she also did not understand why some churches, even in New York, supported slavery. As a teenager, she became aware of women's rights, especially when she was turned down for medical school. No woman could go to medical school in those days. Anyway, when I say women's rights, I should probably say the lack of women's rights, because they were banned from higher education, they were banned from most professions. Even women who needed to work were banned from working in certain jobs, most jobs. Women could not vote. They could not speak in public. They could not serve in juries. They could not testify in court, not even against rapists or abusers. Married women could not own property or sign contracts. Any money that a married woman earned or inherited or was given immediately belonged to her husband, and her husband could beat her, starve her, lock her up in an insane asylum, or turn her out with nothing. If the marriage ended, a woman had no rights to her children. But if a woman, and we're talking about a single woman here at this time, owned land, she had to pay property taxes on it. So, of course, Matilda thought that was very unfair. Instead of becoming a doctor, she married at a young age, at 18. This is the earliest picture I have of her. She's about 24 here with her second child, a son. And notice how she has him in a headlock. This is because picture exposures were long in these days, and they had to hold still for a solid minute. And I think it was hard to hold this kid still for a minute. On the day after this boy was born, July 19th, 1848, what many people consider the very first women's rights convention took place in Seneca Falls, New York, which was only about 50 miles from where Matilda lived. But of course, since she just had a baby the day before, she couldn't go. About 300 people, men and women, met in this church, which is now part of the Women's Rights National Historical Park. And they passed a declaration which said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Sound familiar? The convention was organized by Lucretia Mott, who was a very well-known Quaker abolitionist, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a radical young writer who was living in Seneca Falls at this time. Now, for the convention, Stanton submitted a resolution urging women to seek the vote. And this was so controversial, even for an audience that believed in women's rights, that it almost didn't pass. The idea that women would vote was just too radical. But Frederick Douglass jumped up in the audience and spoke in favor of the resolution. And finally, it did pass, although not unanimously the way the rest of the resolutions did. Anyway, this convention made headlines, and Matilda was a huge newspaper fan, an avid newspaper reader. There were so many newspapers in this time, and by the way, they reported not just on the happenings in the European white society, but they reported on the Indian society too. So when a new chief was chosen or a new ceremony happened, so both cultures were covered in the newspapers, and Matilda loved to read newspapers, and later on had a newspaper of her own. This is her scrapbook, which is in the Library of Congress, of clippings that she'd made of various stories about women's rights from all over the world. And she sometimes annotates it, or something will be crossed out, or she'll write, "No!" exclamation point. So I spent a really fun day reading that in the Library of Congress. This is the very outfit that she wore to her first women's rights convention in Syracuse in 1852. It was Susan B. Anthony's first convention, too. Now, Susan B. Anthony was about 6 years older than Matilda. She had been involved in the temperance movement. And she went to a temperance meeting, and she found out that women were not allowed to speak at temperance meetings. So Susan B. Anthony took herself right out of there and walked over and joined the women's rights movement. A young activist named Lucy Stone, who was wearing what they called reform dress, opened the convention. And Matilda knew nothing about conventions. She'd never been to one. She really didn't know anything about the format, but she had written a speech. And she brought with her her little 6-year-old daughter, her oldest child. And when she got up the nerve, shaking and trembling, she approached the platform with her daughter, holding her daughter by the hand. And Lucretia Mott saw her and realized how frightened she was and invited her to speak. And I think, that if we're lucky, we might be able to hear a part of that very first speech she made, but it'll take a little doing on our part. Oh, there's Lucretia Mott, who invited her to speak. At this time, spiritualism was a very popular fad, and Matilda was always interested in it. She wanted to know how the world worked, and she didn't really accept the religious explanations she had heard, but she did every kind of spiritual thing you could do: astrology, phrenology, palmistry, theosophy at the end of her life. So she really believed in the spirits and seances. So I'm thinking that maybe we could summon her here as a spirit. So let me just try it. Hello, are there any spirits here today? Okay, 2 knocks, that means no, N-O. But we can make it happen. We can make it happen. Let's see, because I think that means there's somebody there who's knocking, you know? So here's how we'll do it. Okay, everybody cross your fingers, close your eyes, click your heels together 3 times. Ready? 1, 2, 3, and say, women's rights. Ready? Women's rights. Okay, is there anybody there now? 3 knocks, that means yes. Please show yourself.
Everyone, pretend that you're in the Syracuse City Hall. This convention has assembled to discuss the subject of women's rights and form some settled plan of action for the future. While so much is said of the inferior intellect of women, it is by a strange absurdity conceded that very many eminent men owe their station in life to their mothers. Trammeled as women have been by might and custom, there are still many shining examples which serve as beacon lights of what may be attained by genius, labor, energy, and perseverance combined. Although so much is said against the unfitness of women for public life, it can be seen from Semiramis to Victoria that she has a peculiar fitness for governing. In poetry, Sappho was honored by the title of the 10th Muse. Helena Lucretia Corano, a Venetian lady who lived in the 17th century, was a woman of such rare scientific attainments that the most illustrious persons in passing through Venice were more anxious to see her than all the curiosities of the city. Mary Kunitz, a native of Silesia, was one of the greatest geniuses of the 16th century. She understood many languages, was skilled in history, poetry, painting, music, and medicine, and these were but amusements. She particularly applied herself to mathematics, and especially to astronomy. Another lady of the 17th century, Anne Maria Schurman, learned in several languages and succeeded admirably in sculpture, engraving, and music. The greatest triumphs of the present age in drama, music, and literature have been achieved by females, among whom may be mentioned Jenny Lind, Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Margaret Fuller Asoli. To those who say women do not desire their rights or think they have them already, I would say converse with any intelligent woman on the subject, and you will not find her indifferent. Self-reliance is one of the first lessons to be taught our daughters. They should be educated with our sons, and equally with them taught to look forward to some independent means of support, either to one of the professions or the business best fitted to exercise their talents. Marriage has been looked to as the acme of hope by women. And why? Because all lucrative and honorable means of support have been seized by men, and women have been driven to marriage as a necessity. At the proposition of equal education and rights, man starts up and says, if women are admitted as equals, you ruin domestic harmony. If a woman is permitted to think for herself, forsooth, she may disagree in views with her husband, and family peace be destroyed. A fig for such reasoning. Those who fear women's incapacity to cope with the trials of life should consider what is now actually thrust upon her by existing customs. Thousands of women are driven to a life of pollution by the insufficiency of wages in those departments of labor which she is legitimately permitted to enter. Let any who doubt read the statistics of London, New York, or any other great city, or the confessions of the poor creatures themselves. One seamstress said, "It was the meager pay I received by labor that led me to go astray. I struggled very hard to keep myself chaste, but found I could not get food and clothing for myself and mother. Could I honestly have earned enough to subsisted upon to feed and clothe myself? I should have remained virtuous. We need not expect the concessions demanded by women will be peaceably granted. There will be a long moral warfare before the citadel yields. In the meantime, let us take possession of the outposts. The public must be aroused to a full sense of the justice of our claims. Beside the duty of educating our children so as to make the path of right easy to their feet is that of discussion, newspaper articles, petitions. All great reforms are gradual. Fear not any attempt to frown down the revolution already commenced. Nothing is more fertile aid of reform than an attempt to check it. Work on, onward, let the truth prevail.
Thank you so much. Well, I think you can understand that this speech caused a sensation, and Lucretia Mott moved that it be published, and Matilda's career into the women's rights movement was absolutely launched. She soon began speaking. It's not clear when she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but they soon became friends. Stanton missed that Syracuse convention because she was home having a baby at the time. But all three of them, Matilda, Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, lived in central New York. And they all traveled to speak at conventions, although it was considered highly improper for a woman to travel alone. Hotels wouldn't rent rooms to single women, and restaurants would not serve them. So they had to pack their lunches, and they had to find boarding houses run by people who were sympathetic to the cause. Wherever they went, they carried two petitions, one for equal rights for women and a second one for a woman's right to vote, because again, voting was so controversial that sometimes people would sign the first one but not the second one. In 1854, the Gage family moved to Fayetteville, which is a suburb of Syracuse now. It's east of Syracuse. And they made their home, as Matilda's childhood home had been, a stop on the Underground Railroad. Matilda's husband, Henry, was a storekeeper, and his new store was just down the hill on the same street as their house. Here's kind of a later ad for the store. You see calico is 5 cents a yard. Here's Matilda in a spoon bonnet. She was a snappy dresser always. And this is right before the Civil War. She's about 35 years old. She had a baby girl, her last baby, Maud, 2 weeks before the Civil War started. The women's movement suspended activities during the war while they worked to support the Union cause. And after the war, Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the left there and Susan B. Anthony started a newspaper, The Revolution, and Matilda became one of its primary writers. Well, at this time, it was a hopeful time. Many people had worked together to abolish slavery and to pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which did abolish slavery. So Matilda and her colleagues in the women's movement helped that the equal rights for women would be a similar kind of joint effort. But then was the 14th Amendment passed, and this is the first one. It says that states cannot deny voting rights to male citizens over age 21. This was the first time the word male was used in the Constitution to describe voters. And then the 15th Amendment came along and said that it granted voting rights regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Well, it could have said regardless of sex. If they had just added one more word, sex, it would have saved about 50 years worth of campaigning and trouble, but they didn't. So some people in the women's movement thought, okay, let's wait until black men get the vote, because this was all about securing the vote for former slaves, and it was thought that men should have the vote first. But some people like Matilda and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony thought, why wait? So in 1869, the women's movement split in two over this issue, and they formed two groups. Matilda was part of the National Woman Suffrage Association, which was the more radical of the two. And Lucy Stone, remember her in her reform dress? She'd given up bloomers by this time, and apparently she'd been eating pretty well, too. But she formed the American Woman Suffrage Association. So the differences between the two were quite marked. The National was radical, the American was conservative. The National wanted votes for women right now, and they wanted another constitutional amendment to do it. The American thought they could get votes for black men first. They called this the Negro's Hour, and that they could make the effort state by state, not nationally. And the National used civil disobedience, and that was something that Matilda really excelled at. So civil disobedience meant that women demonstrated, they withheld taxes, and they tried to vote. And in fact, Mrs. Gage really didn't you earn a reputation as a truly outstanding planner of civil disobedience? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I actually tried to vote in 1871. The voting place was the hotel in Fayetteville. The fun of the thing was that I had 9 women with me in the sitting room of the hotel. I went down first and offered my vote. They were voting in a bar room where, of course, women could not go, but the ballot box was on the door into the hall in which I stood. I was refused on the ground that I was a married woman. So then I took down 2 single women who supported themselves and owned their own homes. Their votes were also refused. Then I took down war widows, whose husbands' bones had been left to bleach on the battlefield in defense of their country. They too were refused, and so on through the whole 9. With each one offered, I made an appropriate argument and had a big and attentive crowd to hear me. The very worst feature of our case was that it was a corporation tax election. Only taxpayers were called on to vote on the raising of the money for putting in waterworks, etc. The largest taxpayer in the village was a woman, as was the smallest. By that time, New York state laws had changed slightly so that even married women could own property in their own names. The women I offered were all taxpayers, and even I was a taxpayer in addition to my husband's being one. It created a great stir.
Now, I believe Susan B. Anthony actually did vote, didn't she?
She bullied the election board into registering her, and then she got arrested. This was wonderful for our cause. It made headlines across the country. To support her, I went to Rochester, and we made speeches all over Monroe County in the time before the trial started. Her speech was entitled, "Is it a crime for a citizen of the United States to vote?" And mine was called, "The United States on Trial, not Susan B. Anthony." And then, after all those speeches, they changed the venue, saying that we had spoken to so many people that we had tainted the jury pool in Monroe County. So the prosecutor moved the trial to Ontario County, and we made speeches there too. Susan gave 21, and I gave 16 before the trial started. I sat with her in the courtroom, and later wrote about the trial in a book called The History of Women's Suffrage. On the bench sat Judge Hunt, a small-brained, pale-faced, prim-looking man, enveloped in a faultless suit of black broadcloth and a snowy white necktie. This was the first criminal case he had been called on to try since his appointment, and with remarkable forethought, he had penned his decision before hearing it. That's right, he had written it out and put it in his pocket. Then when the lawyers had finished presenting their cases, he took it out and read, "Gentlemen of the jury, 2 principles apply here. First, ignorance of the law excuses no one. Second, every person is presumed to understand and to intend the necessary effects of his own acts. Miss Anthony knew she was a woman, and that the Constitution of this state prohibits her from voting. She intended to violate that provision, intended to test it perhaps, but certainly intended to violate it. She voluntarily gave a vote which was illegal, and thus is subject to the penalty of the law." And then he directed the jury to find her guilty, without even letting them deliberate. Jury tainting my eye. Men like that make me tired. I'm sitting down.
Thank you. This is the very courthouse where Susan B. Anthony was tried, the Ontario County Courthouse. And this is my friend Susan on a recent trip to that courthouse. The trial of Susan B. Anthony is the absolute biggest thing that ever happened, maybe in all of Ontario County, but certainly in this courthouse. And if you look at the pictures on the wall, notice that they are all men, still. So I don't know about that. Well, about this same time in California in the 1870s, the women's rights movement took off in the Bay Area, led by Laura DeForce Gordon, who was a lawyer and a newspaper editor. She led the effort, and she worked closely with Matilda and with the National Women's Suffrage Association, and she came to the East Coast to do that, to participate in conventions and work with them. 1875 was a really good year for Matilda. Her children were grown up. That's her youngest was still in high school. That's Maud in the white dress. The other one sitting down is Helen. She was a high school principal. The daughter standing is Julia. She was a teacher. And Clarkson, the son, had graduated from Cornell. All her children went on to higher education. He graduated from Cornell and became a storekeeper like his father. And pretty soon he moved to Dakota Territory to open a store there. So in 1875, as Matilda was elected president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, the whole country was getting ready for a centennial celebration. And so the National planned women's rights activities too. The centennial activities included the first United States World's Fair, which attracted millions of people to Philadelphia in the summer of 1876. So Matilda hurried off to Philadelphia and rented headquarters for the National so that people could come and hear about women's rights while they were in Philadelphia. Then Matilda and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were the National's two main writers, wrote a Declaration of Rights for Women and had thousands of copies printed. They asked for permission to present it to President Ulysses S. Grant at the National July 4th celebration at Independence Hall, but of course they were denied. But that didn't stop them. Matilda, who's in the middle there, Susan B. Anthony, and 3 other members of the National decided to present it to President Grant anyway, whether he wanted it or not. And this is kind of a radical idea. I mean, even in this time, 1876, presidents had security around them. Then at this celebration, there were lots of soldiers and policemen. So it was quite daring to think that they could just give something to the president. Access was tightly controlled. The women got tickets, and they were seated up behind the podium. And they waited until the Declaration of Independence had been read. And then they stormed the podium from behind. Now, Grant had decided not to come, and I can't find out why. If anyone knows that, I'd love to know. That's his vice president, Ferry, sitting down there with the beard. So they gave him a big scroll where they'd lettered the proclamation, and he took it back to Washington and put it up in his office because he believed in women's rights. And then they ran back up the steps, throwing out flyers as they went. They could have been arrested very easily, but they were well-dressed, middle-aged women, and all of the soldiers and all of the police drew back politely and just said, go for it. So they didn't get in trouble that time. In 1878, Matilda bought a newspaper, the National Citizen and Ballot Box, and it became the official paper of the National Women's Suffrage Association. And she wrote for this and for many other newspapers across the country, often about the Indian culture that she admired and looked to as an example. For instance, in the Indian culture, nobody thought that woman was the cause of all evil. She could see that wasn't true. And at the same time, Matilda, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony began working together on a history of women's suffrage. Together, they worked on the first 3 volumes. Again, Matilda and Elizabeth Cady Stanton did the writing. Susan B. Anthony was the business manager and the publisher. In 1881, Matilda had to give up her newspaper because it wasn't making enough money to concentrate on the history and also to take care of her husband and help him in the store. This is her husband, Henry, the only picture I have of him. The economy was poor, and Henry's health was failing, and the store wasn't doing very well either. But still, this is their parlor. They managed to put on 3 weddings for their 3 daughters in 18 months. I think that's pretty good. They were fancy weddings, too. I don't have a picture of the first wedding of Helen. She married a businessman, and they moved to Dakota Territory. And Julia, this is the second one, the teacher, married a former student, and they moved to Dakota Territory. And Maud, the very youngest one, really irritated Matilda by dropping out of Cornell to marry L. Frank Baum. Here Matilda had worked all her life to get women into higher education, and her daughter was going to be a sophomore, and instead she dropped out and married this young man who was a rich young man, but he was a theatrical producer, an actor. He just didn't seem like a very stable kind of person, and he didn't have any education to speak of. So Matilda was not very happy with this choice, but Maud was just as strong-willed as her mother, so Matilda said, okay, if you insist on marrying him, we'll have the wedding here at home. And Frank, his name was Lyman Frank Baum, but he never liked his first name. Frank was such a charming person, such a good person, that he eventually won Matilda's heart when she saw what a good husband and father he was. This is an ad for the musical that Frank had written and was producing and starring in at the time. And when they were first married, Maud went on the road with Frank and they toured with the show. But the show failed pretty quickly, and they moved back to Syracuse, where Frank worked in a family business selling Axle oil, and Maud had 2 baby boys. Matilda's son Clarkson, who lived in Dakota Territory, got married there. So now all 4 of her kids were married, and 3 of them were living in Dakota Territory. In 1886, Matilda helped to stage a demonstration at the dedication of the Statue of Liberty. And you might think, well, why would anyone protest the Statue of Liberty? Well, the answer is they didn't think liberty should be a woman when women had no liberty in the United States. They liked the statue, though. They didn't have any problems with that. The National Women's Suffrage Association got permission. First, they asked for permission to speak at the dedication ceremony, and the answer was no. And the answer was no women would even be allowed on the island. And then they asked for permission to sail in the parade, the Naval Boat Parade, and they got permission for that. Then they had to find a boat. Well, the only boat they could find was a smelly cattle barge, but the captain promised them that he would have it scoured before they came out on this day of the dedication. Well, of course, he didn't have it scoured, and it smelled pretty bad. This is a picture. I have a picture book coming out about this boat trip this fall, and this is a preliminary sketch for it by my illustrator, Edwin Fotheringham. And here's a picture of Matilda's there in the middle with an umbrella, and she's getting on the boat. The women on the boat are holding their noses, and there's the cow getting off the boat on the bottom left part of the picture. I like that very much. Anyway, they made the news. They made the front page of the New York Times with their protest, and to them, that was the best they could hope for, that they made news. People knew why they were out there, why they were demonstrating. In 1888, the National had a meeting of the International Council of Women, and this is the only picture I have of the 3 colleagues together. Sitting down, that's Susan B. Anthony, the second from the left, and that's Elizabeth Cady Stanton with a lace shawl kind of in the middle, and Matilda is the second from the right in this picture. They had women from all over, mostly Europe, but some from India too, and Matilda was one of the organizers of this convention. Well, at this convention, she also met Frances E. Willard, who was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was a charismatic leader, and this was part of a right-wing political movement. Willard wanted Christ to be, this is a quote, the world's king, king of its courts, its camps, its commerce, king of its colleges and its cloisters, king of its customs and its constitutions. So Matilda was really opposed to having a mixture of religion and government. She wanted separation of church and state. But by this time, in the 1880s, they'd been fighting now for 30-some years for votes for women. Susan B. Anthony was ready to make a deal with anybody who would support votes for women. And Willard and the WCTU supported votes for women because they thought women would vote for temperance. So Susan B. Anthony made a deal with, or took up with Frances E. Willard, but Matilda didn't like that combination at all. By this time, Matilda was a widow, and she was spending her winters with the Baums in Syracuse. She couldn't keep that big house going all by herself during the winter, so she lived with the Baums. And then they lived with her in Fayetteville in the summer. Here's a picture of her house in the summer, and there's her daughter Maud sitting on the front porch. And that's Maud's son Frank, the oldest boy, who boys wore dresses in those days. So they were very companionable and very much a family altogether. L. Frank Baum was a fine amateur photographer, and he took this picture of Maud and their two older sons. In 1888, the Baums moved to Aberdeen. Times were hard in New York, but Aberdeen was just thriving. It was a place where several railroads had just been built and met, and the town was growing and businesses were growing, and it seemed like a land of opportunity. So Matilda now began to spend winters in Aberdeen. Not the smartest choice, you think. This was a building where the Baums, Matilda's daughter Helen lived in the upstairs part, and the bottom part became a store that L. Frank Baum ran. But it went bankrupt, and after it failed, he bought a newspaper and it went bankrupt. Meanwhile, Matilda had two more sons in Dakota, so now the Baums had 4 boys. In 1889, Matilda could not afford to travel from Aberdeen in Dakota to Washington for the National's annual convention. And in the past, Susan B. Anthony had doled out money to officers who couldn't make it on their own. She was kind of in charge of the money that was donated. But this time she declined to give Matilda any funding. And that's because she had a plan, which was on the last night of the convention, when most of the people had gone home, at midnight, she passed a resolution to join the National Women's Suffrage Association back with the American Women's Suffrage Association, the two groups back together. The conservatives and the liberals, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union was in there too. So Matilda was outraged. She thought this was terrible. First of all, she thought it was terrible that it was done at midnight on the last night of the convention, a little sneaky to do. She left this group. She left the National American Women's Suffrage Association and started her own organization, the Women's National Liberal Union. And she put on a convention in Washington. And I think it would be appropriate for you to hear some remarks, if you would honor us, Mrs. Gage, again, that she made at that conference in Washington.
Lately, I am frightened at the erosion of freedom currently happening in this country in the hands of the religious right. The National Reform Association, an organization of 11 Protestant denominations, wants to change the Constitution, recognizing God as the source of all power and authority in civil government. Catholics feel the same way. 2 years ago, the Pope issued an encyclical opposing the separation of church and state. He further decreed, "The husband is the chief of the family and the head of the wife. The woman, because she is flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone, must be subject to her husband and obey him." We are told the country is in a dangerous condition, with tens of thousands of uncultured immigrants yearly pouring onto its shores. We are told our flag is hissed by anarchists. But what danger from ignorant immigrants so great? What peril from anarchists so near? What experiment of free government such an utter failure as the admission of 4 new states in 1889, 4 new states in which women cannot vote? The danger menacing our country does not lie with the foreigners, nor the anarchists. Free institutions are jeopardized because the country is false to its principles in the case of 1/2 of its citizens. We must look for the source of this perennial wrong. To a person of thought, this is easily found in early religious training. The church, American, English, Greek, Protestant, Catholic, is the bulwark of women's slavery. Man is trained by the church from infancy that woman is secondary and inferior to him, made for him to be obedient to him. The same idea permeating the Jewish and all Christian churches, all social, industrial, and educational life, all civil and religious institutions. Men have not yet learned to regard women as being of equal creation with themselves, Do not believe that she stands on a par with them in natural rights, even to the air she breathes. We cannot allow our nation to be governed by a hierarchy, by religion, and we cannot disenfranchise every man, woman, or child who does not believe in the Christian doctrines. There is but one thing on earth or beyond that is of real value, but one thing I ever especially desired. That is freedom. Freedom to be myself, to think my own thoughts, to act my own will, to develop in accord with my own intuitions. Freedom is necessary for self-development, for the acquisition of knowledge, for the growth of soul and spirit, mind and matter. So I say, this government of the people, by the people, and for the people seems to be very much limited in the interpretation of the word people. The poor, the women, both married and single, the children, the Indians, and other unfortunate inhabitants are not people. The phrase should be changed to read a government of rich men, by rich men, for rich men. We must fight for equal rights and equal physical, mental, and spiritual liberty of action, thought, and of faith for women and for men. The struggle will be fierce and bitter. A man's enemies will be of his own household, for this storm will be a battle of the liberal element against the church. After a time, liberty will triumph, and then, and not until then, shall we see a true republic upon this soil.
Thank you very much. Woo! Her speech was called The Dangers of the Hour, and the danger was not to maintain separation of church and state. Well, in 1891, the Bombs moved to Chicago, and Matilda moved with them. She loved to take the horse car downtown. Frank got a job working as a salesman for a China company, and they all went many times to the Chicago World's Fair. It was known as the White City, and some people think that the White City is what inspired L. Frank Baum one day to write about the Emerald City. That same year, 1893, Matilda was made an honorary member of the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation and given the name She Who Holds the Sky. As an honorary member, she had voting rights in this Indian nation that she never had in the United States, although she probably did not get to use them. Her most famous book, Woman, Church, and State, was published in 1893. This history told how first religion and then government had oppressed women for centuries, right up to the present time. One example she used was the state of Delaware, where in 1893, the year this book came out, the legal age of consent for sexual activity was 7 years old. Matilda said that this Delaware consent law was passed just to allow villains to assault baby victims. Woman, Church, and State is a really powerful book. I don't know whether this library has it or not, but if you can get a copy, it's good reading. You really would enjoy it, and it's still quite radical. Matilda donated a copy to a school in Fayetteville, and somebody on the school board sent it to Anthony Comstock, who headed the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. So Comstock condemned what he called tales of lust in newspaper articles, and he threatened to bring a suit against anybody who put the book in schools. Matilda was absolutely thrilled. There was nothing that made her happier than to get this kind of censorship. She was just really hoping the Catholics would ban it too, but she failed there. But she always felt invigorated by oppression. Well, L. Frank Baum, while he was traveling and selling china, he was writing little poems and stories and coming home and telling them to his 4 boys. And Matilda liked his stories too, and she encouraged him to write them down. And I always think it's fun to think of L. Frank Baum writing funny stories and poems and fairy tales, and Matilda writing attacks on organized religion right under the same roof, you know? Must have been an entertaining dinner conversation. She was very proud when his first children's book came out in 1897. And this book is about stories he told his sons, like why did the mouse run up the clock, and how could 4 and 20 blackbirds be baked in a pie and survive, etc. Matilda died at the Baum's house in Chicago in 1898, and Maud took her ashes back to Fayetteville for burial. On her tombstone is one of Matilda's favorite sayings: there is a word sweeter than mother, home, or heaven. That word is liberty. And I think you heard how important liberty is to her. After Matilda died, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton deliberately wrote her out of history. And if you want to know how they did it, you'll have to read my book. One person who did not forget Matilda, one writer, was her son-in-law, L. Frank Baum. And he wrote about a strong American heroine in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. In the second Oz book, The Marvelous Land of Oz, he pokes a little fun at the women's movement because he'd lived with it all his life, pretty much. So here's General Ginger and her army of revolt trying to take over the Emerald City. And the truth is, at the end of the second book, Oz is taken over, is ruled then by a fairy princess who is the rightful ruler of Oz. And from that point forward in the series, L. Frank Baum wrote 14 Oz books. Oz is ruled by women, and clearly it's a better place for it, too. Well, Matilda was really forgotten for many years. World War I, World War II came along, but in the 60s and 70s, the 1960s and 70s, a second women's movement came along, and some of those people rediscovered Matilda. This is an Australian scholar, and that cat is holding a victim over the history of women's suffrage. And her question was, this woman was so radical, so timely, sounds so modern. Why didn't I know about her? Why wasn't I taught about her in history? And that question is still being asked, I think. But she is getting found more now. In 1993, Margaret Rossiter coined the term the Matilda effect, which refers to the fact that male scientists often take credit for the work of women. And there was just an article about this in the Smithsonian this fall, so I think Matilda would be thrilled to know that the Matilda effect made it to the Smithsonian. That would be great. In 2010, Matilda's house in Fayetteville became a museum, opened as a museum. So if you go there to the Syracuse area, there's lots of women's suffrage sites to see, and this is one of them. The last slide I'll put up is the slide for my book, this picture book. Now here they are on the cattle barge. Matilda is in a gray coat holding up that sign in the middle. And that's her best friend Lily next to her and Lily's daughter. And the three of them kind of spearheaded this protest at the dedication of the Statue of Liberty. So look for that in the fall. What's sad is that today we still don't have an Equal Rights Amendment. Women don't get equal pay for equal work, and they do not have the right to control their own bodies. And that's just in the United States. In many countries, women are still born criminal for wanting the most basic human rights, like freedom of movement or learning to read. So anyone who wanted to change these conditions would do well to study Matilda's life and techniques. She was the social media queen of her time, but she did it in newspapers. But her techniques work today, too. She said, "The longer I work, the more I see that women's cause is the world's cause." She really was the voice of liberty. So I thank you very much for listening today. And we would be happy to take some questions if anybody has one. Yes. Oh, I started to write about her because, as you mentioned, I was president of the International Wizard of Oz Club. In fact, that's how I know my Matilda. I met her at an Oz Club meeting, and my mother and I wrote a biography of L. Frank Baum in the 1990s, and that sort of put Matilda on my radar. I realized that she was famous and that she was in the women's rights movement. Didn't know much about her. Then I put on a conference in Fresno, a national Oz convention in Fresno in 2010, and there's a scholar named Sally Roche Wagner who's done a lot of work on Matilda, written about her for many years. So she came to the conference and gave a talk on Matilda, and then I was really hooked. And I asked her, should I try to write a book about her? And I don't know why Sally doesn't write a book about her, but she said, sure, go for it. And she helped me, and she read it, and I started in 2010, and it came out in 2018, so it wasn't a quick project, but it's been a lot of fun, though.
Sorry. Mr. Gage was extremely supportive. We shared views on women's rights, but he was shy. And so he stayed home. He ran the store, and he watched after our children when I was on my speaking circuit or at a convention. We did have hired help, but he was a rock at home, holding down the fort. None of my children were writers. You know that my son-in-law obviously was a very famous writer. My children all sort of grew up in the women's rights movement, though. They would come door to door with me with signing petitions, help me plan conferences. None of them went on to write, though.
Which is one reason why maybe she's forgotten when others are remembered. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, who was herself a leader in the second wave of the women's movement, wrote a famous book about her mother and about her life. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote an autobiography, and Susan B. Anthony had someone write a biography of her. But Matilda didn't do those things because she wasn't so interested, I would say, in personal glory as she was just in getting the job done. So while they wanted their personal stories out there, she was just trying to make a difference. She's making it into some collective biographies now, so I feel like progress is being made. I think, that history, who writes history and who... I just went to Hamilton, and that show asks the question, too, who controls history? Who tells the story of history? Mostly it's, since Matilda's death in 1898, it was pretty much controlled by men who weren't interested in women's history anyway. But I think many movements focus on one or two people, like Susan B. Anthony wanted to be the star of the women's movement, wanted the focus to be on her. And when she cut Matilda out, nobody missed her because they still had Susan B. Anthony. Same way, like Martin Luther King represents the civil rights movement, and Cesar Chavez represents rights for workers. They just picked Susan B. Anthony and stuck with her. Even Stanton really pretty well got lost in that mix.
Not that I'm aware of.
No. There's a school, another person who was written out of history was Matilda's best friend, Lily Devereux Blake, who's in the middle in this picture, okay? And Lily Devereux Blake's daughter there was a teacher on the Upper East Side of New York, taught for many years, became a principal, and after a while they named the school the Lily Devereux Blake Elementary School, and it's still named that today. And so that's really fun, and I'm hoping when the book comes out I get to go visit that school and see what it's like. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I started writing with my mother in the late 1980s. Sorry, I got Victorian on the... and I was still working full-time then, so, they came kind of slowly. We wrote these middle grade biographies, and I wrote a scholarly book about Frances Hodgson Burnett, and I don't know, this one took the longest of all. And I had quit work. Part of this time I was retired, and I just did it all the time. But it took me months and months just to read her letters. I had them on microfilm. Her handwriting is terrible. Just that one project took months.
How did you find the letters?
Well, when I can't even remember anymore. They're at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, which is part of Harvard, and they have a very famous women's collection there. And somehow I guess this scholar, Sally Roche Wagner, knew Matilda's granddaughter, who was also named Matilda. They talked a lot, and Matilda's granddaughter had all the family papers. And Sally Roche Wagner convinced Matilda's granddaughter to donate them to the Schlesinger so that people would have access to them. And I'm sure I learned that from Sally Roche Wagner, but it's been so long ago I can't remember.
I feel like that last speech of Matilda's is very timely, and powerful to read about the separation of church and state. It sounds like something that a speech that you could give now. But honestly, I sort of admire her marriage. I feel like they were very supportive of one another, and I feel like Henry was a really remarkable guy to say, sure, I'll take care of 4 kids. I'll take care of our 4 kids while you run around the country. And she talked about battles on the home front, right? That men's enemies would be within their own homes, but he clearly didn't feel that way, and I think that's neat.
Well, the thing I came to admire most about her was this idea that if you meet opposition, you're doing something right, and you should celebrate. I wish I could feel that way, What if you got a bad book review and you thought, oh, I'm doing something right? So I really admired that in her. And it was her father who taught her that. You'd like to think so. You do. I don't know much about Henry's relationship with his mother, but he was certainly a loving father to his daughters. And they were all, he was teased and called a henpecked husband, and his children were teased and told that their mother was a terrible, awful, people thought it was satanic to believe in women's rights. I mean, it wasn't just bad, it was nasty and evil and wrong. And so the children felt bad, and when they would come home and be sad that they had been teased, Matilda and Henry would teach them that those children who said those things were just ignorant, and they did not know what they were saying. So he definitely thought about his daughter. I mean, Matilda's husband had 3 daughters and 1 son, and he was close to all of them. Well, thank you so much. We've got books for sale in the back, and we'll be around if you want to talk or ask more questions. Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, I didn't say Caitlin's name. Caitlin Masters is Matilda, and I thank her so much.